In 1226 BCE, mid-November, a royal barge arrived in Wasset, modern Luxor. The ship sailed upriver, its great sails unfurled to catch the breeze, and rowers adding momentum. As it passed the temple of Karnak, the ship turned to starboard and headed west. It entered a canal and cruised slowly along the way. Soon, the vessel docked at the quay before a grand temple. Labourers hauling on ropes drew the barge alongside the stone walkway. Tying up, the ship arrived at its destination, the temple that we call the Ramesseum. A crowd gathered in the courtyard, watched as priests disembarked the great ship. Burning incense, they raised their voices in hymns of prayer. Alongside, priestesses shook their sistrum rattles and added their voice to the melody. It was a melancholy song. From the deck, porters brought forth a bed. Atop lay a white parcel, a body wrapped in fine linen and glittering with gold. It was the mummy of Egypt's pharaoh. Ramesses II was dead. Hello, and welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast, episode 235, Ramesses the Great God. Four months earlier, Ramesses began his 67th year on the throne. He was now one of, perhaps the, longest reigning monarchs in Egyptian history. Politically and religiously, it was an era of continuity not seen in centuries. Outside Egypt, other kingdoms could only dream of such stability. The Hittites, for example, had seen 3 rulers reign and die in the span of Ramesses' life. The Assyrians had lost 2 monarchs in the same time. The Babylonians were onto their 6th king. For those up to speed on international politics, the Nile Valley must have seemed a blessed place. Multiple generations had lived in quiet stability. That continuity was carefully managed, even at the end. In the last decade of his reign, we actually hear very little of Ramesses himself. The written records, and even the art, present him as a mostly ceremonial figure. In the public eye, monuments put Ramesses' son front and center. It seems that the crown prince, Mer-Nep-Ptah, now directed policy for his aging father. That was not a negative, or even unusual. In fact, the Egyptians had a phrase for this very phenomenon. When a son deputized for his father and then inherited his job, it was called the Medu Yawi, or Staff of Old Age. An ancient wisdom text called the Maxims of Ptah-Hotep explains the idea. Quote, "Old age has arrived, infirmity has descended. My lord and master, the king, permit your humble servant to appoint a staff of old age. Let my son succeed to my position. To that end, I will instruct him in the wisdom of those who lived in earlier ages. So may the same be done for you." This kind of family apprenticeship wasn't a specific job, but it described that time of transition. Mer-Nep-Ptah filled this role for Ramesses in the last years of the royal life. And in the public realm, the crown prince provided a face to royal power and a promise of continuity when the day finally came. So politically, business was handled and stability assured. Pharaoh could relax from his official duties. Unfortunately, on the personal front, the last years of Ramesses' life were painful. Studies of his mummy by X-ray and CT scans show that the king suffered multiple ailments towards the end. The king's teeth are badly worn, probably from grit in his bread. His gums were inflamed, and chewing was an uncomfortable experience at best. Arthritis attacked his limbs, and movement became an issue. His spine developed a hump, and mild scoliosis twisted him slightly to the right. Eventually, these back issues caused Ramesses to walk bent nearly double, perhaps hobbling with a staff. The king also suffered from atherosclerosis, or hardening of the arteries, which restricted blood flow and caused cold feet and hands. The winter months must have been particularly cruel. Through all of this, there was at least one ritual where people might see Ramesses in public. The Royal Jubilee, or Sed Festival, continued regularly even as Pharaoh aged. Ramesses had celebrated the first Sed Festival in regnal year 30. By the time he died, the king had conducted at least 12 more. In total, 13 jubilees are recorded on monuments. Scholars can track them thanks to the inscriptions left by high officials. In year 45, Ramesses' herald named Kai announced the 6th Sed Festival. The 11th took place in year 60, the 12th in 63, and the 13th and final around year 66. By this point, the Sed Festival must have been a diminished affair. Ramesses' physical health was declining, and those displays of endurance and strength would be increasingly difficult. And yet, the festivals occurred regularly every few years. Did the king, perhaps supported by his son, force his way stiffly through the ceremony? Did courtiers watch anxiously as he endured yet another display? Did they worry at his ability to complete it, or even to survive? Or did they see Ramesses' age as a manifestation of divine will? Across the millennia, literate Egyptians left monuments describing the ideal old age. They hoped that, with a perfect life, they might reach an age of 110 years. Whether anyone actually did is a moot point. That was the wish. From that perspective, maybe Ramesses' longevity was a mark of the gods' favor, that they loved him and wanted him to endure as king. Perhaps, for the faithful, such enduring reign was itself a sign. The living Horus now more closely resembled the sun god Ra. In mythology of this era, stories speak of Ra as an old man, aging in the twilight. You could imagine that a devoted practitioner of the religion, privileged to see Ramesses up close, might view the old ruler as the very image of that god. Speaking of gods, across the decades, Ramesses' public image evolved significantly. In the early years, he had emphasized his role as the great warrior, with grand temple art showing him in battle. Then he became the diplomat, commemorating his treaty with the Hittites. Then he was the family man, fathering dozens of children and displaying them on temple walls in long parades. He was the pious son of the gods, making his offerings and bestowing gifts on their cults. He was the builder who funded enormous temples, new cities, and towering statues throughout his realm. Finally, there was the aspect of Ramesses that we might call the living god. Starting in year 30 and accelerating afterwards, the king appeared in art as a new deity on earth. Now, all pharaohs were gods to some extent, incarnations of Horus and all that, but occasionally a monarch would make their divinity literal and present, creating a new religious cult to celebrate their godhood. Ramesses was one of those. Scholars have identified the process by which King Ramesses created a new divine persona. At temples like Abu Simbel, a new being shows up in art, an avatar called Ramesses Pa-Netcher, or Ramesses the God. This being appears in statuary, like the great colossi that bear distinctive names and their own priests and priestesses. Ramesses the God also shows up in the royal cartouches. In the later decades, the king's royal names start to call him Ramesses the God who rules Iunu, or Heliopolis, and Ramesses the Ra, or sun, whom the gods fashioned. That second title sounds fairly straightforward, but you can also translate it as Ramesses the Ra, or sun, who creates the gods. Basically, it was a divine pun that presented Ramesses as a child of the deities and a creator in his own right. That may sound egotistical, but if you think about creation in terms of building and making things, it does make more sense. Over his long reign, Ramesses had lavished enormous resources on new temples, additions to existing ones, and of course, statues or images of the gods. From that perspective, he was a physical creator for the deities. If Ramesses now included himself in the pantheon, well, hadn't the pharaoh earned it? This Ramesses the God idea was not an abstract royal phenomenon. It also had a tangible connection to the common folk. If you visit Karnak Temple and go to the very back, near the outer wall, you can still find a small chapel. It is disconnected from the main house of Amun, and it faces towards the east, or sunrise. This chapel was constructed in the days of Ramesses II, and it is devoted to the king as a god. The chapel is called the House of Ramesses Sechem-Nechet, or Ramesses who hears prayer. The idea seems to be a place of worship connected to the king himself, a shrine where people could make offerings to statues of Ramesses and seek his divine blessing. Today, the chapel of Ramesses who hears prayer is within the great enclosure walls of Karnak, but those did not exist at the time of the king. Instead, the chapel probably faced out to the wider world, and it may have been designed as an accessible place, somewhere ordinary folk could approach the image of the king and seek his assistance. Of course, it was a way to promote Ramesses, but it also made his divinity more immediate, more meaningful to the people. Similar chapels probably existed in other cities, and we know from written and artistic records that the great colossal statues were often the object of worship. Chances are, in all of the major towns, there was an image of Ramesses, to whom the faithful could pray. All of this is to say that in the later years of Ramesses II, the king became, or made himself, more than your average pharaoh. Across Egypt, statues and shrines commemorated him as a new member of the pantheon, a great god incarnate. But what happens when a god dies? Ramesses' final day arrived in August of 1226 BCE. In Egyptian terms, it was the second month of Akhet, the flood season, day 6. Remarkably, we do have a record of the event. Excavations in the Valley of the Kings have uncovered an ostrakon, a piece of limestone with text on it. It records the announcement of Pharaoh's death. Apparently, artisans working in the valley noted the day when the, quote, chief of Magi, or police, came with news of Usir Ma'at Ra Setep En Ra, Ramesses II. Subsequently, the team put down their tools and, quote, stood still, not working, for 5 full days. Apparently, the passing of the king brought all work to a halt. That may have been practical, as the artisans waited for new instructions, or it may reflect the significance of the occasion. For the faithful, this was a solemn moment, the passing of a Horus into eternity. More importantly, it was the first time any of them had experienced this change. By the time workers in the Valley of the Kings received this news, Pharaoh had probably been dead for at least 2 weeks. Studies of Ramesses' mummy suggest that he died in the far north. The body is encrusted with sand used in the embalming process, and that sand is a mix of desert salts and marine sodium. So the priests preserved his body with the normal material from the Wadi Natrun to the west, and also local sand from the Nile Delta. From that, it's a fair bet that Ramesses died at his northern capital, the great city Ramesses. By tradition, the mummification took 70 days, approximately. If Ramesses died in late August, his embalming should have been complete by early November. Winter was descending, the days were growing shorter, the breeze from the north bringing an unmistakable chill. When the body was ready, the funeral party gathered at Ramesses' palace, and they set sail, heading south. 2 weeks later, the ship would reach the southern city, Waset, or modern Luxor. From there, it was a short journey to the Valley of the Kings. As the porters carried Ramesses' body off the ship, onlookers raised their voices in grief. Women, perhaps professional mourners, tore their clothing and cast themselves to the ground. Their dresses, formerly white linen, became stained with dust and the black streaks of eye makeup running from tears. Grabbing sand, the women threw it over their heads as the royal body passed. The priests and priestesses marched slowly through the temple. At their head, Merneptah led the way. Now in his 40s, the staff of old age performed one last duty. He would take his father to his tomb. Arriving at the Ramesseum near the Nile River, the funeral party now prepared for the long walk to the valley, made of wood and gold and shaped like a shrine. Over its head, the mummy now bore a mask of gold and glass, which glittered in the winter light. When everything was ready, Ramesses began his final journey. The cortege marched out of the Ramesseum, following a path to the north. Walking slowly, they passed the temples of great ancestors: Amenhotep II, the sportsman, Thutmose III, Hatshepsut, and Montuhotep in the western valley, Der al-Bahri, and the temple of Seti I and Ramesses I, scions of this royal house. They also passed farms and the small villages attached to the great temples. As they walked, crowds of locals must have gathered to witness the final passing of the pharaoh. For most of them, Ramesses was the only king they'd ever known. At last, the procession turned west and entered a desert valley. Over small hills and rocky paths, they made their way towards the secret place. On the hills above, the shadow of guards, Magi, watched the procession. The walk took several hours, what with the sled and treasures that required transport. Eventually, though, the mourners arrived at Ta Set Ayat, the Great Place, what we call the Valley of the Kings. Above, the mountain peak called Meret Seger, or She Who Loves Silence, loomed like a natural pyramid. All around, the graves of kings, queens, and courtiers lay hidden within the rocks. The party ascended the slope, heading for the entrance of Ramesses' tomb, located in a central part of the valley, just a couple dozen meters from the now forgotten tomb of Tutankhamun. Ramesses' sepulchre was ready. The funeral procession left the sunlit world and descended into the grave. Daylight receded, darkness enveloped them. Servants lit torches and led the way. Carefully, the mourners passed along a series of sloping corridors. They walked about 150 meters, or 492 feet, before turning right to enter the burial chamber. This was the room called Per Nebu, the House of Gold. Today, Ramesses' tomb has suffered badly from flooding, and most of the decoration is lost. But fragments survive, including the funerary texts. Ramesses went to his rest protected by sacred writings like the Amduat, the Book of the Dead, and the Book of Gates. There was also the Book of Praising Ra in the west, also known as the Litany of Ra. It was a newish text that sought the sun god's guidance through the night and the underworld. As the body of Ramesses entered his tomb, priests may have said things like, quote, "Beginning of the Book of Praising Ra in the west, adoring the Unified One." One recites this book in the deep of night. It means that Ra triumphs over his enemies. O Ra, who is within his cave, praise be to you, 4 times. May you guide me, the deceased, along the paths of the west, so that I might praise the gods who are within the hidden chamber, or tomb. Hail Ra, as I go to rest in the underworld. As you are, so am I. Your effective words are my effective words. Your wanderings are my wanderings. Greetings to you, gods who are in the west. May my soul, or Ba, pass over your secrets. I am one among you. End quote. With recitations such as these, the priests laid Ramesses to rest. They placed jewelry, bands of gold, and flowers atop the mummy wrappings. Finally, porters lowered the coffin lid into place. Ramesses' mask, his golden face, disappeared into darkness. Merneptah now stepped forward and raised an adze, a type of chisel, made of iron. He touched it to the lips, nose, eyes, and ears of the coffin. This opening of the mouth allowed Ramesses' effigy, and his spirit within, to use his faculties in the next world. As he did so, Merneptah would recite the following, quote, Formula for opening the mouth of the Osiris, Ramesses II, the great god, true of voice. He, the deceased, now says, "My mouth is opened by Ptah. The bindings on my mouth have been untied." With this, his adze, which is made of sky metal, iron. It is the one with which he opened the mouths of the very gods. End quote. The iron touched the coffin mouth. Merneptah finished the rite. Was he silent, or did he weep? We'll never know. But as Ramesses went into his tomb, the reign of the great god officially ended. After nearly 7 decades on the throne, the death of Ramesses II in year 67 must have seemed a momentous change. You'd be hard-pressed to find anyone in Egypt who could remember a time when Ramesses wasn't the ruler. And compared to the decades before Ramesses, his reign was an unparalleled tenure of stability. You could imagine that as Ramesses' body departed for the Valley of the Kings, those in the palace and the government looked at each other and said, "What now?" In the short term, continuity was assured, thanks to the long service of Merneptah as crown prince. And now king in his own right, Ramesses' son did his best to keep the ship of state on course. But while Merneptah was competent and successful, things were changing in the wider world and Egyptian society. Scarcely 10 years after Ramesses' passing, deep cracks began to manifest in the royal household. Disputes and conflicts would break the stable succession. A mere 20 years after his death, the kingdom would be racked by civil war and bloodshed. Eventually, a new lineage of kings arose that both replaced and continued Ramesses' legacy. They did so intentionally, self-consciously taking his glamorous image as their own. Before too long, history would produce a Ramesses III, then a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, an eighth, a ninth, a 10th, and an 11th. And maybe a 12th, but we'll get there when we get there. These new monarchs looked directly at Ramesses the Great God for their inspiration. In one notable case, a later Ramesses even asked the gods publicly to, quote, "Grant me the long lifespan which you gave Ramesses II, for I sit upon his throne." The image of Ramesses II, the eternal god-king, remained potent for centuries. Sometimes that adherence to a glorious past brought great trouble for the royal house and the wider society. As we'll see shortly, the shadow of Ramesses was long, and while it provided cool relief to some, for others it became a consuming darkness. Meanwhile, societies outside Egypt were experiencing their own troubles. The rumblings of discord that we have recently encountered, drought, food shortages, wars, and rumors of wars, would become more frequent. Soon, the Kingdom of Egypt would face huge eruptions of violence, invasions on the borders, corruption and conflict at home, monarchs overthrown, even assassinated, and all the difficulties of a great ship of state weathering a geopolitical tempest. For some, the reign of Ramesses II is a high watermark of splendor, after which things become less glamorous and thus less interesting. There's some truth to that if your preference lies in towering monuments, golden treasures, or even simple peace and quiet. But if you love the messiness of history, or even a good story, the next couple of centuries are rather dramatic. I look forward to sharing it with you. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. Next time, we'll wrap up the story of Ramesses II with a look at his legacy. Like many of his age, Ramesses became the subject of stories and mythology in the centuries following his passing. These include tales of a descent into the underworld, and even hanging out with Helen of Troy. Then we'll touch on his memory in the modern age and consider how he stacks up with the pharaohs who have come before. That is the next episode. For those interested, stick around after the thank yous for a brief epilogue, in which I explain the dates of Ramesses' death and the chronology of his reign overall. Just a bit of extra historiography for those who are interested. Otherwise, thank you for listening. I'll see you soon. The History of Egypt podcast is supported by the fine folks who subscribe to the show on Patreon. In particular, I must thank the priests, wonderful folks like Jeffrey, Kate, Erin, Karen, Alicia, Carlos, Yen, Andrew, Farron, Dan B, Suyon, Mallory, Erjan, James B, Veronica, Dan S, Niden, Andy and Chelsea, Mycost, TJ, Yola, Terry, Eric, Chris, and Linda. Folks, you are all too kind. May the gods favor you with longevity twice that of Ramesses II, and may your efforts in work, hobbies, or relationships be an inspiration to future generations. The reign of Ramesses II ended a couple of months into his 67th year. His rule is unusually well documented compared to earlier monarchs. Thanks to the work of archaeologists, we have dated inscriptions and artifacts for every single year of Ramesses II's reign. The very last record is year 67, in the first month of Akhet, day 18. About a month later, the very same document records a new date, year 1, the second month of Akhet, day 19. That gives historians a 4-week time frame in which Ramesses probably passed. We can narrow that down further with the ostracon I described early in the episode. The tomb builders of Deir el-Medina recorded the announcement of Ramesses' death in the second month of Akhet, day 21. They were receiving news that had traveled, by ship, the full length of the country. So logistically, Ramesses probably died at least 10 days earlier. That lines up with records from later generations, when villagers celebrated a festival called the Sailing of Ramesses. The sailing, quote-unquote, was a euphemism for the death, and they marked that occasion in the second month of Akhet, day 6, which is 15 days before the announcement arrived in the south. So historians can pinpoint with reasonable confidence the likely date of Pharaoh's passing. As for the regnal years, that was never an issue. Several decades after Ramesses II, another king begged the gods for a life and reign of equal length. And he specifically said, quote, "More numerous are the achievements which I have done than that which Ramesses II did in his 67 years. Finally, authors of the classical era, like Manetho, described the rule of Ramesses mi Amun, or Ramesses beloved of Amun, as 66 full years and 2 months. Apparently, the longevity of this monarch left a lasting impression in the historical record. I've covered his reign in about 30 narrative episodes, but I could probably have doubled that and still not run out of material. There's a lot of artistic stuff that I'd like to cover in video form, and I'll do as much as I can over on Patreon and later on YouTube. There is always more to say about Ramesses II.